Being a new mom is tough. I was completely exhausted from the constant sleepless nights with my newborn daughter, Lily. She was only 2 months old, and I was still trying to figure out this whole parenting thing. My husband had gone back to work, so I was alone with Lily most of the time. That afternoon, I was trying to catch up on some much-needed rest while Lily napped. I had the baby monitor next to me on the couch, its soft white noise a constant reminder of my new reality. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by Lily's cries coming through the monitor. I rubbed my eyes, still groggy from my short nap. The crying continued, and I pushed myself up from the couch, my body aching from the awkward position I'd been sleeping in. As I made my way up the stairs to Lily's room, I noticed how quiet the house was apart from her cries through the monitor. When I reached her room, I pushed the door open, expecting to see her squirming in her crib, but as I approached, my stomach dropped. The crib was empty. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was still half asleep and imagining things. But no, the crib was definitely empty. I frantically looked around the room, thinking maybe I had sleepwalked and put her somewhere else. Under the changing table, in the closet, even behind the curtains. Nowhere. I ran my hands over the sheets in the crib, still warm from where she had been lying. Then I heard it again, Lily's cry. But this time, I realized it wasn't coming from the monitor. It was coming from outside the room. I dashed out into the hallway, calling out for her even though I knew she couldn't answer. I checked every room upstairs, growing more panicked with each empty space I found. As I rushed back downstairs, I could hear her cries more clearly. They seemed to be coming from next door. That couldn't be right. I pressed my ear against the wall we shared with our neighbor's house. Sure enough, I could hear Lily's distinctive wail. Without thinking, I ran out of my house and over to my neighbor's front door. I had only met her a couple of times since we moved in. She was an elderly woman who lived alone, always polite but kept to herself. I think her name was Mrs. Thompson, but I wasn't sure. I banged on the door, not caring if I seemed crazy. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, the door opened. There stood Mrs. Thompson, looking surprised to see me. And in her arms was Lily, still crying but seemingly unharmed. Relief flooded through me for a split second before being replaced by utter confusion and a creeping sense of dread. How did my baby end up here? I must have looked as shocked as I felt because Mrs. Thompson started speaking before I could even form words. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry if I frightened you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I heard her crying through the wall and, well, I just wanted to help. I stood there, trying to process what she was saying. She continued, "I used to be a nurse, you see. I thought maybe you were having trouble getting her to settle. I should have asked first, I know. But the door was unlocked, and I just thought..." Her words trailed off as she looked down at Lily, who had started to quiet down. I noticed tears in Mrs. Thompson's eyes as she gently rocked my daughter. "I just wanted to hold a baby again," she whispered, more to herself than to me. It's been so long since... The realization of what had happened hit me like a truck. This woman had entered my house, taken my baby, and brought her next door, all while I was asleep. The thought made me feel sick to my stomach. I stepped forward, my arms outstretched. "I need to take her back now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mrs. Thompson looked up at me, and for a moment I saw a flash of something in her eyes. Reluctance, maybe even possessiveness. But it passed quickly, and she carefully handed Lily over to me. As soon as I had Lily in my arms, I clutched her tightly to my chest, breathing in her familiar baby scent. I backed away from the door, mumbling something about needing to get home. Mrs. Thompson stood in her doorway, wringing her hands. "I truly am sorry," she called out as I hurried back to my house. I miss it so much. Being needed, caring for someone. I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I could think about was getting Lily back into our home, locking the door and never letting her out of my sight again. As I closed and locked my front door, I could still see Mrs. Thompson standing in her doorway watching us. My hands were shaking as I checked Lily over, making sure she was okay. She seemed fine, already drifting off to sleep in my arms, but I couldn't shake the fear and violation I felt. How could I have slept through someone coming into my house and taking my baby? What if Mrs. Thompson hadn't been as harmless as she seemed? What if she had decided not to bring Lily back? I sat on the couch, still holding Lily close, my mind racing with all the terrible what-ifs. The baby monitor sat on the coffee table, silent now. I realized I'd have to be more careful, more vigilant. I couldn't let my exhaustion put Lily at risk again. As the adrenaline started to wear off, I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. The reality of what had just happened, how close I had come to losing my daughter, hit me full force. I knew I should call my husband, maybe even the police, but at that moment, all I could do was sit there, holding Lily and listening to her peaceful breathing, trying to calm my racing heart. The afternoon sun was starting to fade, casting long shadows across the living room. I could still see Mrs. Thompson's house from our front window. The curtains were drawn now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she might be watching us. I knew I'd never be able to look at her the same way again. How could I ever feel safe in my own home knowing how easily someone could come in and take the most precious thing in my life? I thought about all the times I'd left the door unlocked, thinking our neighborhood was safe. All the times I'd dozed off while Lily napped, trusting that she'd be fine in her crib. It all seemed so naive now. The world suddenly felt much more dangerous, much more unpredictable. As I sat there, I realized that this experience had changed me. The carefree, sometimes forgetful new mom I had been just hours ago was gone. In her place was someone more cautious, more aware of the potential dangers lurking in even the most seemingly innocent situations. I looked down at Lily, peacefully sleeping in my arms, unaware of the terror I'd just experienced. I made a silent promise to her and to myself. I would be more careful. I would be more alert. I would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The baby monitor remained silent, but I knew I wouldn't be using it to sleep anymore. From now on, I'd be listening for every sound, every movement. The innocence of those early days of motherhood was gone, replaced by a constant nagging fear. But as I held Lily close, feeling her warmth and listening to her soft breaths, I knew it was a small price to pay for her safety. As the last light of day faded, I finally stood up, my legs stiff from sitting for so long. I carried Lily upstairs to her room, my eyes darting around, checking every corner, every shadow. I laid her gently in her crib, my hand lingering on her tiny chest, feeling the reassuring rise and fall of her breathing. I knew I wouldn't be sleeping much that night or for many nights to come, but as I stood there watching over my daughter, I felt a fierce determination building inside me. This was my child, my responsibility, and I would do whatever it took to protect her. The world might be full of unexpected dangers, but it would have to go through me to get to Lily. With one last look at my sleeping baby, I turned to leave the room, already planning the new security measures I'd be putting in place. The innocence of new motherhood might be gone, but in its place was a strength and vigilance I never knew I had. And for Lily, I'd be strong enough to face whatever came our way. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. Working nights isn't easy, but it's been my routine for the past 3 years. I'm a nurse at the local hospital, and the night shift just sort of stuck with me. It's not ideal, but it pays the bills and leaves my days free for other things. Plus, I've always been a bit of a night owl anyway. That morning, I was walking home from my shift as usual. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban streets. Most people were still asleep, their houses dark and silent. It's funny how different the world looks at that hour. Peaceful, but also a little eerie. I live in one of those neighborhoods where all the houses look pretty much the same. White picket fences, neatly trimmed lawns, that sort of thing. It's the kind of place where nothing ever really happens. Or at least, that's what I thought. As I turned onto my street, something caught my eye. It was Mr. Lambert's house, 2 doors down from mine. His front door was slightly ajar. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but in our neighborhood it was unusual. We're the kind of people who double-check our locks before bed. At first I thought maybe he'd just forgotten to close it properly when he left for work. But then I remembered, Mr. Lambert was retired. He didn't leave for work anymore, and it was way too early for him to be up and about. I stood there for a moment, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to just go home and crawl into bed. I was exhausted after my shift, and it really wasn't any of my business. But something didn't feel right. What if Mr. Lambert had fallen and couldn't get to the phone? What if he was sick? Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. I walked up to his front porch, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the early morning quiet. As I got closer, I could hear something from inside the house. It sounded like scrubbing. I knocked on the doorframe, calling out Mr. Lambert's name. No response. The scrubbing sound continued. My palms were starting to sweat, and I could feel my heart beating faster. Something was definitely off. I pushed the door open a little wider and peered inside. The entryway was dark, but I could see light coming from the living room. And that's when I saw it. Mr. Lambert was on his hands and knees in the middle of the room, scrubbing furiously at the carpet. But it wasn't just any stain he was trying to clean. The carpet was soaked with what looked like blood. A lot of blood. For a moment I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Mr. Lambert must have heard me because he suddenly looked up. Our eyes met, and I saw something in his that made my blood run cold. It wasn't fear or panic or even surprise. It was calm. Too calm. He stood up slowly, still holding the scrub brush in his hand. It was dripping with pinkish water. He looked at me, then down at the carpet, then back at me. And then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that makes you want to run and never look back. Mr. Lambert started talking, his voice eerily casual, as if we were discussing the weather. He said his wife had a bad nosebleed in the night. That's why there was so much blood. He was just cleaning it up before it stained the carpet permanently. But as he spoke, my eyes were darting around the room. The amount of blood was way too much for a nosebleed. And where was Mrs. Lambert? Shouldn't she be resting if she'd lost that much blood? I mumbled something about hoping she felt better soon and backed away slowly. Mr. Lambert just stood there, watching me leave, still wearing that unsettling smile. As soon as I was out of sight of his house, I practically ran the rest of the way home. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my heart pounding. What had I just witnessed? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it really was just a nosebleed. Maybe Mrs. Lambert was at the hospital getting checked out. Maybe I was overreacting because I was tired from my shift. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The image of Mr. Lambert calmly scrubbing that blood-soaked carpet kept replaying in my mind. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that scene in Mr. Lambert's living room. I tossed and turned, debating whether I should call the police. But what would I say? I hadn't actually seen anything illegal. Just a man cleaning his carpet. It sounded ridiculous even in my own head. Throughout the day, I kept peeking out my window, watching Mr. Lambert's house. Everything seemed normal. I saw him leave at one point, get in his car and drive away. He came back a few hours later with groceries. Just a normal day in the life of a retiree. By the time I had to leave for my next shift, I had almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. Almost. My shift that night was busy, which was a blessing. It kept my mind off what I'd seen that morning. But as I walked home the next day, I felt a sense of dread growing with each step. As I turned onto my street, I saw them. Police cars. At least 3 of them, parked in front of Mr. Lambert's house. Their lights were flashing silently, painting the quiet street in alternating red and blue. I stood there frozen as officers went in and out of the house. Neighbors were starting to gather on their lawns, whispering to each other. I caught snippets of their conversations as I slowly approached. Mrs. Lambert, missing Days. Blood. It felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. Mrs. Lambert was missing, had been missing for days, and I had seen her husband cleaning up her blood. One of the officers noticed me standing there and approached. He asked if I lived nearby, if I knew the Lamberts. I nodded, unable to find my voice. And then he asked the question I had been dreading. Have you noticed anything unusual in the past few days? In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the sweat beating on my forehead. I thought about Mr. Lambert, about that calm smile as he explained away the blood on his carpet. I thought about Mrs. Lambert, who I now realized I hadn't seen in over a week. I opened my mouth, not even sure what I was going to say. But before I could speak, there was a commotion from the house. More officers were coming out, and between them was Mr. Lambert. He wasn't smiling anymore. His hands were cuffed behind his back, and he was staring straight ahead, his face blank. As they led him to one of the police cars, his eyes met mine. And in that moment, I knew that what I had seen wasn't a nosebleed. I knew that Mrs. Lambert wasn't coming back, and I knew that the quiet, normal life I thought I had been living was gone forever. The officer was still waiting for my answer. I took a deep breath and started to tell him what I had seen. About the open door, the blood-soaked carpet, Mr. Lambert's unsettling calmness. With each word, I felt the weight of what had happened settling onto my shoulders. As I finished my story, I watched the police car carrying Mr. Lambert drive away. The flashing lights faded into the distance, but the image of him scrubbing that carpet was burned into my memory. I knew it would haunt me for a long time to come. The officer thanked me for my information and went back to the house. I stood there for a while longer, watching as they strung crime scene tape across the Lamberts' front yard. Neighbors were still whispering, now looking at me with a mix of curiosity and fear. I turned and walked back to my house, feeling like a stranger in my own neighborhood. The sun was fully up now, but the world felt darker than it ever had before. As I unlocked my front door, I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets were hiding behind the neat facades of our quiet suburban street. I stepped inside my house and closed the door, leaving the noise and chaos outside. But I knew that the peace and safety I had once felt in this neighborhood were gone. The world had changed overnight, and I had been an unwitting witness to its transformation. Living alone in a small apartment in the city has its perks. I've always enjoyed the independence and the quiet. My place isn't fancy, but it's mine, you know. I've been here for about 3 years now, and I thought I knew every inch of it. It started with small things. At first, I didn't even notice. I'm not the most organized person, so when I couldn't find my favorite watch one morning, I figured I'd just misplaced it. I tore apart my bedroom looking for it, but it never turned up. I was frustrated, but I chalked it up to my own carelessness. A few weeks later, I was getting ready for a night out with friends. I went to put on the pair of silver earrings my mom had given me for my birthday. They weren't in my jewelry box where I always kept them. I searched everywhere, even in ridiculous places like the fridge and the trash can. Nothing. I ended up wearing different earrings, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then there was the money. I'm not rich by any means, but I always keep some cash tucked away in my desk drawer for emergencies. One day I went to grab a 20 for lunch and noticed the stack seemed thinner than I remembered. I counted it. $50 was missing. I racked my brain trying to remember if I'd spent it, but I came up empty. These incidents kept piling up. A necklace disappeared, then a bracelet. Some loose change from my bedside table. Each time I told myself I was just being forgetful or careless, but deep down a nagging feeling was growing. Something wasn't right. I started paying more attention to my belongings. I'd take mental notes of where I left things. I'd count my cash regularly. But still, things kept disappearing. It was like trying to hold on to sand. The harder I tried to keep track, the more seemed to slip through my fingers. The worst part was the doubt. I started questioning my own memory. Had I really left that book on the coffee table? Or was I imagining things? Was I going crazy? I even considered seeing a doctor, wondering if I was experiencing some kind of early onset memory loss. But then I started noticing other things. tiny details that were off. A chair slightly out of place. A window I could have sworn I'd closed now cracked open. The sensation of walking into a room and feeling like someone had just been there. It was subtle, but unmistakable. That's when the fear set in. Not a dramatic, heart-pounding kind of fear, but a slow, creeping dread that settled in the pit of my stomach. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had been touching my things, invading my space, and they'd been doing it right under my nose. I became hyper-vigilant. I'd check and recheck the locks on my doors and windows. I'd inspect my apartment every time I came home, looking for signs of intrusion. I even considered setting up cameras, but the thought of catching someone on video in my home made me feel sick. Then one night I had an idea. It was a long shot, but I had to know. The next morning I went through my usual routine of getting ready for work. But instead of leaving, I quietly closed the front door and tiptoed back inside. I found a hiding spot in my bedroom closet where I could see most of the apartment. And I waited. The silence was deafening. Every creak of the building, every distant siren made me jump. Time seemed to crawl. I was starting to think I was being ridiculous when I heard it, the soft click of a key in the lock. My breath caught in my throat as I watched my front door slowly open. A figure slipped inside and I recognized him immediately. It was my neighbor from across the hall, the quiet guy who always gave a polite nod in passing, the one who'd helped me carry groceries up the stairs once when the elevator was out. He moved through my apartment with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. He knew exactly where to go, what to look for. I watched in silent horror as he rifled through my desk drawer, pocketing the cash I kept there. He moved to my jewelry box next, selecting a few pieces and slipping them into his pocket. All the while, he was so calm, so casual, like he was browsing a store, not stealing from his neighbor. It was surreal, watching this invasion of my privacy in real time. I wanted to jump out, to confront him, to scream. But fear kept me rooted to the spot. He was thorough, checking all the usual hiding spots. Under the mattress, in the nightstand, even in the pockets of jackets hanging in the closet where I was hidden. I held my breath as he came close, terrified he would discover me. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he seemed satisfied. He did one last sweep of the apartment, his eyes roving over everything. Then, as casually as he'd entered, he left, locking the door behind him. I stayed in the closet for a long time after he'd gone, my mind reeling. All those months of doubt, of questioning my own sanity, came crashing down. I hadn't been losing things. I hadn't been forgetful. I'd been robbed over and over again by someone I saw almost every day. When I finally found the courage to come out of hiding, my apartment felt different, tainted. Every surface he'd touched, every place he'd looked felt violated. The sense of security I'd had in my own home had been shattered. I stood there, in the middle of my living room, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront him, to demand answers. How long had this been going on? How did he get a key to my apartment? But another part of me was terrified of what he might do if he knew I'd caught him. We'd been living in our house for about 5 years when the new neighbors moved in next door. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where kids rode bikes on the sidewalks and people waved to each other while mowing their lawns. My husband and I had 2 kids, a dog, and a life we'd worked hard to build. The day the moving truck pulled up, I was out front watering the flowers. The couple seemed friendly enough. They smiled and waved as they carried boxes into their new home. I remember thinking how nice it was to have new faces in the neighborhood. Over the next few weeks, we'd chat over the fence. Small talk mostly, the weather, local restaurants, that sort of thing. They seemed to be settling in well. I even brought over a homemade pie to welcome them properly. But then things started to change. It was subtle at first. A comment here and there about our dog barking. Now, our dog isn't a constant barker, but sure, he'd let out a few woofs when the mailman came or if a squirrel caught his eye. I apologized and said we'd keep an eye on it. Then it was about our kids playing in the backyard. They said the noise was disturbing their afternoon naps. I tried to be understanding. I explained that we always brought the kids in by early evening, but they were just being kids during the day. They didn't seem satisfied with that answer. The complaints kept coming, each one more nitpicky than the last. The way we parked our cars in the driveway, the time of day we mowed our lawn, even the wind chimes on our porch seemed to bother them. I tried to be a good neighbor. I really did. We started keeping the dog inside more. We asked the kids to play in the front yard instead of the back. We even took down the wind chimes. But nothing seemed to be enough. One day I decided to repaint our house. It had been looking a bit worn, and I thought a fresh coat would brighten things up. I chose a soft yellow, nothing too bold. But oh, you would have thought I'd painted it neon green with purple polka dots. The woman next door came storming over, practically spitting with anger. She said the color was garish and bringing down property values. I was stunned. It was just yellow paint, for crying out loud. But she wouldn't let it go. She demanded we change it back immediately. That's when I realized this wasn't about paint or barking dogs or noisy kids. These people were looking for things to be upset about, and they'd found their target in us. From that point on, it was like living next to a ticking time bomb. Every day brought a new confrontation. They'd wait until we stepped outside, then they'd be right there, ready with a fresh complaint or accusation. They started filming us. Anytime we were in our yard, out would come the phones, recording our every move. It felt invasive, like we were constantly under surveillance in our own home. The threats started not long after that. At first, they were vague. Things like, "You'll be sorry if you don't keep that mutt quiet," or, "Those brats of yours better stay off our property or else." But they got more specific over time. They threatened to call Child Protective Services, claiming we were neglectful parents. They said they'd report us to the Homeowners Association for every tiny infraction they could think of. I started feeling anxious every time I had to leave the house. Would they be out there, waiting to pounce? What new accusation would they hurl at us today? I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, even in my own yard. The kids picked up on the tension. They started asking why the neighbors were always mad at us. We tried to shield them from it as much as we could, but kids are perceptive. They knew something wasn't right. One afternoon, things came to a head. I was in the backyard with the kids, watching them play on their swing set. Suddenly, I heard shouting from the other side of the fence. The man was yelling about the noise, using language I'd rather not repeat. I called for the kids to come inside, not wanting them to hear it. As we headed toward the house, something came flying over the fence. It narrowly missed my daughter's head, landing with a thud in the grass. It was a rock about the size of my fist. I stood there, frozen, staring at it. Had our neighbor really just thrown a rock at my children? I ushered the kids inside and locked the door. My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone to call the police. This had gone beyond simple neighbor disputes. This was dangerous. As I waited for the police to arrive, I could hear the neighbors outside still yelling. They were making wild accusations, saying we'd attacked them first, that we were harassing them. It was like they were living in an entirely different reality. The police came, and I told them everything. The months of harassment, the escalating threats, and now this rock-throwing incident. They took statements and said they'd look into it. But as the police car pulled away, I realized this was far from over. The neighbors stood in their driveway, glaring at our house. I could feel their eyes boring into me through the window. This was our home, the place where we were supposed to feel safe. But in that moment, watching those angry faces, I'd never felt more vulnerable. The apartment complex I lived in was nothing special, just a standard 5-story building with about 50 units. I'd been there for a couple of years, and it was fine. Not luxury by any means, but clean and quiet enough. I didn't know many of my neighbors. We'd nod in the hallways or elevators, but that was about it. I first noticed the smell on a Tuesday evening. I'd just gotten home from work and was unlocking my door when this faint, unpleasant odor hit me. It was hard to describe. Kind of musty and sour. I figured someone had probably left their trash out too long, or maybe cooked something that went bad. Over the next few days, the smell got stronger. It was especially noticeable in the hallway near my apartment and the one next door. I started holding my breath whenever I walked from the elevator to my unit. The odor was a mix of rotting food and something else I couldn't quite place. It made my stomach turn. By the weekend, it was bad enough that I decided to mention it to the building manager. I caught him in the lobby and told him about the smell. He just shrugged and said he'd look into it, but didn't seem too concerned. I hoped that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The smell kept getting worse. It was seeping into my apartment now, even with all the windows open. I bought air fresheners and scented candles, but nothing could mask it completely. I started getting headaches and feeling nauseous at home. I noticed I hadn't seen my next-door neighbor in a while. He was an older guy, lived alone. We weren't friends or anything, but usually I'd see him coming and going every few days. Now that I thought about it, I couldn't remember the last time I'd spotted him. The following week, I went to the building manager again. This time, I was more insistent. I told him the smell was unbearable and that something had to be done. He seemed annoyed but said he'd send maintenance to check it out. A day passed, then two, and nothing changed. The smell was still there, worse than ever. I started asking other residents if they noticed it too. Most just wrinkled their noses and hurried past. A few admitted they'd smelled something but figured it wasn't their problem. I felt like I was going crazy. How could no one else be as bothered by this as I was? By the third week, I couldn't take it anymore. The stench was so strong I could taste it. It clung to my clothes, my hair. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I entered the building, I felt like I was walking into a wall of decay. I cornered the building manager again. This time, I didn't hold back. I demanded that he do something, anything, to find the source of the smell. He muttered something about not being able to enter apartments without cause and suggested I call the police if I was so worried. At first, I hesitated. Calling the police seemed extreme. But as another day passed and the odor intensified, I realized I had no choice. This wasn't just about comfort anymore. Something was seriously wrong. I dialed the non-emergency number, feeling a bit foolish as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. To my surprise, they said they'd send someone over to check it out. I paced my apartment, waiting for them to arrive. When the officers knocked on my door, the smell in the hallway was the worst it had ever been. They noticed it immediately, their faces scrunching up in disgust. I explained everything, how long it had been going on, my failed attempts to get management to address it, my concerns about my neighbor. The officers looked at each other, then at the door next to mine. They knocked loudly, announcing themselves as police. No answer. They knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I could see the concern on their faces now. One of the officers radioed for backup while the other tried to get more information from me about my neighbor. How long had it been since I'd seen him? Did he have any family or friends that visited? I realized I knew almost nothing about the man who lived just a few feet away from me. More officers arrived, along with the building manager. He looked pale and nervous as he fumbled with the master key. The police told me to stay back as they prepared to enter the apartment. The moment they opened the door, the smell hit us like a physical force. I stumbled back, gagging. The officers covered their faces with their sleeves, but it did little to block the stench. They entered cautiously, flashlights sweeping the darkened interior. I couldn't see inside from where I stood, but I heard their muffled voices. Then one of them came out quickly, looking green. He spoke quietly to his partner, who immediately got on his radio, calling for medical examiners. That's when I knew. The realization washed over me in a sickening wave. My neighbor was dead. Had been dead for weeks, probably. While I'd been going about my life complaining about a smell, his body had been decomposing just on the other side of my wall. The hallway became a flurry of activity. More police, paramedics, people in white suits. I answered their questions in a daze, still trying to process what had happened. How could someone die and no one notice? How could I have lived next to that for so long without realizing? As they finally removed the body, covered and on a stretcher, the full impact of the situation hit me. For weeks, I'd been smelling my neighbor's decomposing body. Every time I came home, cooked a meal, tried to sleep, it had been there, just a few feet away. The ordinary act of living in my apartment had become intertwined with this man's lonely, unnoticed death. The police finished taking statements and left. The building manager avoided eye contact as he hurried away. I stood in the hallway, staring at my neighbor's door, now sealed with police tape. The smell lingered, a reminder of what had been hidden behind that door for so long. I knew it would take more than air fresheners to erase this memory. The place I called home would never feel the same again. I've lived in this quiet suburban neighborhood for about 5 years now. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, at least by sight. My next-door neighbor was an elderly woman who'd been there for decades. We'd wave to each other when we were out in our yards, but that was about the extent of our interaction. One afternoon, she came over while I was mowing the lawn. She seemed a bit flustered and asked if I could help her with her computer. She said she was having trouble sending emails to her grandkids. I wasn't exactly a tech expert, but I figured I could probably figure out the basics. So I agreed to stop by later that day. When I knocked on her door that evening, I could hear shuffling inside before she opened it. The first thing that hit me was the smell, a mix of mothballs and something vaguely floral. She ushered me in, and I immediately noticed how cluttered the place was. Every surface seemed to be covered with knickknacks and old magazines. She led me to a small desk in the corner of her living room where an ancient desktop computer sat. As I moved towards it, something caught my eye. There was a stack of Amazon boxes piled up near the couch. At first, I didn't think much of it. Lots of people order stuff online these days, even the elderly. But then I noticed another pile behind an armchair, and another by the TV stand. As I looked around, I realized the room was filled with Amazon packages of various sizes. Some were opened, others still sealed. It was odd, but I tried to focus on the task at hand. As I sat down at the computer, I couldn't help but glance at some of the opened boxes. That's when a chill went through me. I recognized one of the items, a set of kitchen knives I'd ordered weeks ago but never received. I blinked hard, thinking I must be mistaken, but then I saw another familiar item, a book I'd been waiting for. My mind started racing. I'd had several packages go missing over the past few months. I'd complained to Amazon, gotten refunds, reordered things. It had been frustrating, but I'd chalked it up to porch pirates or delivery mix-ups. Now sitting in my neighbor's cluttered living room, surrounded by what I was becoming increasingly certain were my missing packages, I felt a creeping sense of unease. I tried to focus on fixing her email, but my eyes kept darting around the room, spotting more and more items I recognized. A yoga mat, a set of gardening tools, even a shirt in my size that I remembered ordering. My hands felt clammy as I typed, my mind whirling with questions and disbelief. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to sort out her email issue. She seemed pleased, chattering about how she could now send pictures to her grandchildren, but I barely heard her. I was trying to figure out how to address the elephant in the room, or rather, the mountain of packages. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I took a deep breath and carefully asked about all the Amazon boxes. Her face lit up, and she started talking about how wonderful it was that she got so many presents delivered. My stomach dropped as I realized she genuinely believed all these packages were meant for her. I gently tried to explain that I thought some of the packages might actually be mine. I pointed out the kitchen knives, explaining that I had ordered a set just like them. Her expression changed instantly. The warm smile vanished, replaced by a look of suspicion and anger. She accused me of trying to steal her things. I tried to stay calm, to explain again, but she wasn't listening. Her voice got louder, her words more hostile. She started picking up packages and clutching them to her chest, glaring at me as if I was going to snatch them away. I stood up, holding my hands out in what I hoped was a non-threatening gesture. I tried one more time to explain, mentioning the missing deliveries, but she cut me off. She jabbed a finger at me, her hand shaking, and accused me of making up stories to rob an old woman. The situation was spiraling out of control. This woman I'd known as a friendly neighbor for years was now looking at me with pure hatred. I felt trapped in the cluttered room, surrounded by my own stolen possessions, facing an elderly woman who seemed to be teetering on the edge of a full meltdown. I knew I had to get out of there. I started edging towards the door, still trying to calm her down. but every word I said seemed to make things worse. She followed me, still hugging packages to her chest, her accusations getting wilder by the second. As I reached for the doorknob, she lunged forward, trying to block my exit. I managed to open the door, but she grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. I gently but firmly removed her hand and stepped outside. She stood in the doorway, still shouting accusations. I backed away, my heart pounding. The last thing I saw as I turned to hurry back to my own house was her face, a mixture of anger, fear, and confusion that I knew would haunt me for a long time. I slammed my own door shut behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. Through the walls, I could still hear her voice, now muffled but still clearly agitated. I stood there frozen, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The realization that my elderly neighbor had been stealing my packages for months, genuinely believing they were hers, left me feeling shaken and unsure of what to do next. I'd been living in my apartment for about 6 months when I first noticed something odd. It was small at first. A picture frame on my dresser was slightly askew. I straightened it without much thought, figuring I must have bumped it while cleaning. A few days later, I noticed one of my kitchen drawers wasn't fully closed. Again, I didn't think much of it. I was often in a rush in the morning, so I assumed I'd just been careless. But then things started to feel off. I'd come home from work and swear the throw pillows on my couch were arranged differently. My shampoo bottle in the shower seemed to be in a slightly different spot. It was nothing I could put my finger on, just a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I started paying more attention to how I left things when I went to work. I'd make mental notes of where exactly I placed items on my coffee table or how I left my bed made. And sure enough, I'd come home to find tiny changes. A book moved an inch to the left. My comforter pulled up slightly higher than I'd left it. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. I even considered the possibility that I was sleepwalking or doing things I didn't remember. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Someone was in my apartment when I wasn't there. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt violated, scared, and angry all at once. I started looking around my apartment with new eyes, wondering what else this intruder might have touched or moved. I became obsessed with checking everything when I got home. I'd inspect my closet, looking for any sign that someone had rifled through my clothes. I'd examine my food in the fridge, trying to determine if anything was missing. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but I couldn't stop. Then came the day I found the toothbrush. It was just sitting there in my bathroom, a bright green toothbrush I'd never seen before. I stood there staring at it, my own toothbrush frozen halfway to my mouth. There was no denying it now. Someone else had been in my bathroom using my sink, probably even my shower. I felt dirty, like I needed to scrub every surface in my apartment. But more than that, I felt a deep, primal fear. This person, whoever they were, had access to my private space. They could come in any time I wasn't there. The thought kept me up at night, jumping at every little sound. I knew I had to do something, but I was afraid to go to the police. What if they didn't believe me? All I had was a mysterious toothbrush and a bunch of tiny, easily explainable inconsistencies. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I bought a small hidden camera online. It arrived a few days later, and I spent an entire evening figuring out how to set it up. I finally managed to hide it on a bookshelf in my living room, angled to capture most of the apartment. The next morning, I left for work with a mix of dread and anticipation. All day, I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept drifting back to my apartment, wondering if the camera would catch anything. When I got home that evening, everything looked normal, but I knew the truth would be in the footage. With shaking hands, I retrieved the camera and connected it to my laptop. At first, there was nothing, just hours of an empty apartment. But then, movement caught my eye. Someone was entering through my front door. As they came into view, my breath caught in my throat. It was my neighbor from across the hall. I watched in horror as he casually strolled through my apartment like he owned the place. He went straight to my fridge, helping himself to my food. Then he disappeared into my bathroom. When he emerged, his hair was wet. He'd used my shower, But the worst was yet to come. He went into my bedroom and opened my closet. I felt sick as I watched him try on my clothes, admiring himself in my mirror. He spent nearly an hour in my apartment before finally leaving, locking the door behind him as if nothing had happened. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what I'd just seen. This man, whom I'd exchanged polite nods with in the hallway, had been invading my space for who knows how long. The depth of the violation was almost too much to bear. I spent the next day in a daze, unsure of what to do. I knew I should go to the police, but part of me was afraid of confronting the reality of the situation. So I did the only thing I could think of. I changed my locks. The locksmith came that afternoon. As he worked, I saw my neighbor watching from his doorway. Our eyes met, and I saw a flicker of something. Anger? Fear? Cross his face before he quickly retreated into his apartment. That evening, I felt safer knowing he couldn't get in anymore. But as I was making dinner, I heard a key in my lock. The door opened, and there he was, looking confused and then angry when he realized his key no longer worked. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then he turned and ran. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding. I could hear him in the hallway, fumbling with his own door, then silence. I stood there back against the door, trying to catch my breath. The reality of what had been happening, of how close I'd been to this intruder all along, came crashing down on me. My sense of safety, of home, had been shattered, and I knew it would never be quite the same again. Moving into my new apartment was supposed to be a fresh start. The building seemed nice enough, not too fancy, but clean and well-maintained. I remember feeling optimistic as I carried boxes up the stairs, nodding hello to the other residents I passed. It was about a week after I'd settled in that I first met my upstairs neighbor. He was a tall guy, probably in his early 30s, with short cropped hair and a friendly smile. We chatted briefly by the mailboxes, and he mentioned he'd recently moved in too. He seemed perfectly normal, just another young professional in the city. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. I was getting used to my new place, figuring out my commute and generally settling into a routine. But then I started noticing some odd noises coming from the apartment above mine. At first, it was just the occasional thud or bump, nothing too out of the ordinary. I figured maybe my neighbor was just a bit clumsy or had a habit of dropping things. But over time, the noises became more frequent and more intense. I remember lying in bed one night, unable to sleep because of the constant thumping overhead. It sounded like someone pacing back and forth for hours on end. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably nothing to worry about. Maybe he was just a night owl or had trouble sleeping. But then the screaming started. The first time I heard it, I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding. It was a raw, agonized sound, not like someone watching a scary movie or having a nightmare, but like someone in real pain or terror. I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? Go up there and check? In the end, I just sat there, frozen, until the screaming stopped. After that night, things only got worse. The noises became more frequent and more disturbing. Sometimes it was just the pacing and thumping. Other times I'd hear crashes like furniture being thrown around. And the screaming, God, the screaming. It would come at all hours, day and night, piercing through the ceiling and setting my nerves on edge. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was going through a tough time. Maybe he had some kind of condition that caused outbursts. I even considered the possibility that he was being abused by someone, though I never saw anyone else going in or out of his apartment. I started talking to some of the other neighbors, trying to figure out if anyone else had noticed anything strange. Most of them seemed oblivious, but one elderly woman who lived on the same floor as my upstairs neighbor mentioned that she'd been hearing awful racket at night. She'd complained to the building manager, but apparently nothing had come of it. The constant disturbances were taking a toll on me. I wasn't sleeping well, jumping at every sudden noise. Even when things were quiet, I found myself on edge, waiting for the next outburst. I started spending more time out of the apartment, dreading coming home each evening. One night, things came to a head. I had finally managed to fall asleep despite the occasional thumps from upstairs. But sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a sound I'd never heard before. Footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Heavy, frantic footsteps pacing back and forth. I lay there barely breathing, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. For a moment there was silence. Then, without warning, someone started pounding on my door. It wasn't a normal knock. It was violent, desperate, like someone was trying to break the door down. I scrambled out of bed, my mind racing. What should I do? Call the police? Try to talk to whoever was out there? Before I could decide, I heard a voice. My upstairs neighbor's voice, but twisted and frantic in a way I'd never heard before. He was shouting, his words tumbling over each other. I couldn't make out everything he was saying, but I caught phrases like, "They're coming," and "have to get out." He kept insisting that I let him in, that it wasn't safe out there. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, as he continued to pound on the door. I could hear the desperation in his voice, the raw terror. Part of me wanted to help him, but a stronger part was terrified of what might happen if I opened that door. The pounding got more intense. I heard a crack and realized with horror that the door frame was starting to splinter. He was going to break in. In that moment, my fear overcame everything else. I ran to my bedroom, snatched up my phone, and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. As I spoke to the dispatcher, trying to keep my voice steady, I could hear my neighbor's ravings getting more incoherent. He was shouting about government conspiracies, about people watching him, about dangers lurking in every shadow. The door gave another ominous crack. I don't know how long I huddled in my bedroom listening to the chaos outside my door. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Finally, I heard new voices in the hallway, deep, authoritative voices shouting commands. The police had arrived. There was a scuffle, more shouting, and then, finally, silence. I crept out of my bedroom, my legs shaking so badly I could barely walk. When I opened my apartment door, I saw 2 police officers leading my neighbor away. He wasn't struggling anymore. He looked dazed, almost catatonic. One of the officers stayed behind to talk to me. As I stammered out what had happened, I couldn't help but notice the damage to my door. Deep gouges in the wood, the frame bent and splintered. It hit me then just how close I'd come to real danger. The officer was sympathetic but professional. He took my statement and assured me that my neighbor was being taken to get help. As he was leaving, he mentioned something that made everything suddenly click into place. Apparently, my neighbor was a veteran who suffered from severe PTSD. In that moment, all the fear and anger I'd been feeling shifted into something else, a mix of pity and lingering unease. I thought about all those nights of screaming and thumping, imagining what kind of nightmares he must have been reliving. It didn't make what happened okay, but it gave context to the chaos I'd been living with. As I stood there in my doorway, looking at the damage and trying to process everything that had just happened, I felt a weird mix of relief and sadness. Relief that the immediate danger was over, but sadness for the suffering that had led to this point. I knew I wouldn't be getting any more sleep that night. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the sky slowly lighten as dawn approached, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. The moving truck next door caught my attention one Saturday morning. I was watering the plants on my front porch when I saw him, my new neighbor. He was a tall guy, probably in his early 30s, with short dark hair and a friendly smile. As he struggled with a heavy box, I offered to help. That's how our friendship began. Over the next few weeks, we'd chat whenever we saw each other outside. He was easy to talk to, always ready with a joke or an interesting story. He told me he'd just moved to the area for a new job in IT. We bonded over our shared love of sci-fi movies and craft beer. It was nice having a friendly face next door, especially since I'd been feeling a bit isolated since moving to this neighborhood myself a year ago. Our conversations became more frequent. We'd often catch up in the evenings when we both got home from work. He'd tell me about his day, and I'd share stories about my job at the local library. Sometimes we'd grab a beer together on the weekend or watch a game. It felt good to have made a new friend. One night, about 2 months after he'd moved in, I was sitting on my couch, flipping through channels on TV. I wasn't really paying attention until a breaking news alert caught my eye. The local news was reporting on a series of burglaries in our area. They said the burglar had been targeting homes in several neighborhoods, including ours. I sat up straighter, suddenly alert. Our neighborhood had always seemed so safe. As the reporter continued talking, they mentioned that the police had released a sketch of the suspect based on witness descriptions. When the sketch appeared on the screen, I felt my stomach drop. The face staring back at me from the TV was eerily familiar. The short dark hair, the shape of the nose, the set of the jaw. It looked just like my new neighbor. I blinked hard, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no matter how many times I looked away and back again, the resemblance was undeniable. For a moment, I just sat there, frozen. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing. It couldn't be him, could it? He was so friendly, so normal. We'd spent hours talking, laughing. How could he possibly be a burglar? I tried to rationalize it. Lots of people have short, dark hair and similar facial features. It was probably just a coincidence. But the more I stared at that sketch, the more certain I became that it looked exactly like the man living next door to me. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. Was that a footstep outside? The sound of a door opening? I kept imagining my neighbor sneaking around in the dark, breaking into homes. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge. Over the next few days, I found myself watching my neighbor closely. Every interaction we had, I scrutinized. Was there something suspicious in the way he checked his mail? Did he seem nervous when we talked about the local news? I started paying attention to his comings and goings. Did he leave at odd hours? Come back with things that might be stolen? But no matter how much I observed, I couldn't find anything definitively suspicious. He still seemed like the same friendly, normal guy I'd gotten to know. He'd wave when he saw me, ask how my day was going. We even had another beer together that weekend, and he seemed completely at ease, laughing and joking as usual. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging doubt. What if I was living next door to a criminal? What if he was using our friendship as a cover? The thought made me feel sick. I started making excuses to avoid hanging out with him. When we did talk, I was distant, guarded. I could tell he noticed the change, but I couldn't bring myself to act normal around him anymore. My paranoia grew with each passing day. I installed new locks on my doors and windows. I started keeping my curtains drawn at all times. At night, I'd lie awake, listening for any sound that might indicate someone trying to break in. The burglar hadn't hit our immediate area yet, but what if we were next? What if my neighbor was just waiting for the right moment? I debated whether I should call the police. But what would I say? That my friendly neighbor looked kind of like a sketch on TV? I had no real evidence, just a nagging suspicion. What if I was wrong? I'd be falsely accusing an innocent man, ruining his life and our friendship over what might be nothing more than a coincidence. The stress was taking a toll on me. I was jumpy, irritable. My coworkers at the library noticed, asking if everything was okay. I brushed off their concerns, not knowing how to explain the constant fear I was living with. About 3 weeks after I'd first seen the sketch, something happened that pushed my suspicions into overdrive. It was late, probably around midnight, and I was having trouble sleeping as usual. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside. Peering through my blinds, I saw my neighbor leaving his house. He was dressed all in black, carrying a backpack. He looked around furtively before hurrying down the street. My heart was pounding. This was it, wasn't it? He was going out to commit another burglary. I felt paralyzed with indecision. Should I call the police, follow him? What if he saw me? What if he realized I suspected him? In the end, I did nothing. I just stood there, watching until he disappeared from view. Then I spent the rest of the night pacing, imagining all the crimes he might be committing. When morning came and I saw on the news that there had been another burglary in a nearby neighborhood, I felt sick with guilt. Had I allowed it to happen by not speaking up? That was the final straw. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't live with this fear and guilt anymore. I decided I would go to the police station that day after work. Even if they couldn't do anything, at least I would have tried. I felt nervous, but relieved as I drove to the station, rehearsing in my head what I would say. As I walked up to the station, my neighbor's face flashed across my mind. What if I was wrong? What if I was about to ruin an innocent man's life? But I pushed the doubts aside. I had to do this. I had just reached for the door handle when my phone buzzed. It was a news alert. I almost ignored it, but something made me look. The headline made me freeze. Suspected burglar caught in neighboring town. With shaking hands, I opened the article. There was a photo of the man they'd arrested. He looked nothing like my neighbor. The resemblance to the sketch was there, but it wasn't nearly as strong as I'd thought. As I read further, I realized the burglar had been operating in our area, but lived in a town 20 miles away. I stood there, my hand still on the door handle, as the reality of what had almost happened sank in. I'd been ready to accuse my innocent neighbor of being a criminal, all because of a vague resemblance to a sketch. The fear and suspicion that had consumed me for weeks suddenly seemed ridiculous. Feeling dazed, I turned away from the police station and walked back to my car. As I drove home, I thought about all the time I'd wasted being suspicious and afraid. I thought about how I'd pushed away a friendship over nothing. I pulled into my driveway, still trying to process everything, when I saw my neighbor in his yard. He waved, smiling as always, completely unaware of how close I'd come to upending his life. Living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, I always thought I knew what to expect from my surroundings. Our house wasn't anything special, just a modest 2-story with a small backyard where my son loved to play. It was his favorite place to kick around his soccer ball, practicing tricks and imagining he was a famous player. The first time his ball went over the fence into our neighbor's yard, I didn't think much of it. Kids will be kids after all. I remember walking around to their front door, planning to just ask for the ball back and maybe apologize for the inconvenience. But when I got there, something felt off. The curtains were drawn tight, not a sliver of light peeking through. It was the middle of a sunny afternoon, but the house looked dark and lifeless. I rang the doorbell and waited. No answer. I tried knocking, but still nothing. After a few minutes, I gave up and walked around to their backyard. I figured I'd just grab the ball and leave a note explaining what happened. As I approached their back door, I noticed the curtains were drawn here too. It struck me as odd. Who keeps their house closed up so tightly on a beautiful day? I quickly found my son's ball and was about to leave when a smell hit me. It was faint but unmistakable, a sour, rotten odor that made my nose wrinkle. I couldn't quite place it, but it was deeply unpleasant. For a moment, I wondered if maybe an animal had died somewhere nearby. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, I hurried back to my own yard. Over the next few weeks, my son's ball went into their yard a handful more times. Each time I'd go to retrieve it, and each time the house was the same. Curtains drawn, no signs of life, and that persistent, strange smell. I started to feel a growing sense of unease every time I had to go over there. One day, as I was reaching for the ball, I noticed something that made me pause. There was a small gap in the curtains of one of the ground floor windows. I didn't mean to pry, but I couldn't help glancing inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was a mess, papers and clothes strewn everywhere, empty food containers piled up. It looked like no one had cleaned in months. My mind started racing. Were our neighbors okay? Were they sick? Injured? I tried to push away the darker thoughts that were creeping in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I decided to try knocking on their door again. This time, I was sure I heard movement inside, a shuffling sound, like someone walking slowly across the floor. But still, no one answered. The silence that followed was somehow worse than if no one had been home at all. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that messy room, the drawn curtains, the strange smell. What if our neighbors needed help but couldn't ask for it? What if they were trapped in there somehow? The questions kept swirling in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. The next day, I tried to go about my normal routine, but I couldn't focus. Every time I looked out the window at their house, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. I decided to talk to some of the other neighbors to see if anyone else had noticed anything strange. The couple across the street said they hadn't seen our neighbors in weeks. The old lady next door mentioned that their trash cans hadn't been put out for collection in a while. Everyone I spoke to had a slightly different story, but they all shared the same underlying tone of concern and confusion. As the days went by, my worry only grew. I started paying more attention to the house, watching for any signs of activity. Sometimes late at night, I'd see a faint light moving behind the curtains, like someone walking around with a flashlight. Other times, I'd hear muffled noises that sounded like arguments, but I could never make out any words. The smell got worse too. On warm days, it would waft across our yard, making my son complain and ask to play inside instead. It was a sickly, sweet odor now, mixed with something chemical. It reminded me of the time we had a mouse die in our walls, that same decay smell but stronger and more complex. After about a month of this, I couldn't take it anymore. The constant worry was eating away at me. I kept imagining worst-case scenarios. Our neighbors lying injured, unable to call for help, or something even more sinister. I knew I had to do something. I decided to call for a welfare check. I'd never done anything like that before, and I felt nervous as I dialed the non-emergency police number. The operator asked me a series of questions about why I was concerned. As I explained about the drawn curtains, the strange smells, and the lack of activity, I could hear how crazy it all sounded. But the operator took me seriously, assuring me they'd send someone to check it out. The next afternoon, I saw a police car pull up in front of our neighbor's house. 2 officers got out and approached the front door. I watched from my living room window, my heart pounding. They knocked, waited, then knocked again more forcefully. Just when I thought no one would answer, the door opened. I couldn't see who was inside, but I saw the officers talking, their postures tense. After a few minutes, they went inside. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes. Finally, the officers emerged. They talked briefly on the front step, then one of them walked over to my house. When I opened the door, the officer's expression was stern. He asked if I was the one who had called for the welfare check. When I said yes, he told me that our neighbors were fine, just very private people. He said they were upset about the intrusion and felt their privacy had been violated. I tried to explain my concerns, the smells, the mess I'd seen through the window, the lack of activity. But the officer cut me off. He said that unless I had concrete evidence of a crime or immediate danger, I shouldn't be peering into my neighbors' windows or calling the police on them. I felt my face getting hot with embarrassment and frustration. I wanted to argue to make him understand why I'd been so worried. But before I could say anything else, I heard shouting from next door. Our neighbors, a middle-aged couple I'd only seen a handful of times before, were standing on their front step, glaring in my direction. The woman was pointing at me, her face red with anger. I couldn't make out everything she was saying, but I caught phrases like nosy neighbor and mind your own business. The officer turned back to me with a warning look. He said that while he appreciated citizens looking out for each other, in this case, I'd overstepped. He advised me to leave my neighbors alone unless I had real evidence of wrongdoing. As the police car drove away, I stood in my doorway, feeling a mix of relief, embarrassment, and lingering unease. Our neighbors were still on their front step, watching me. The woman said something to her husband and they both laughed, a harsh mocking sound that made me flinch. I quickly went back inside, my face burning. Through the window, I saw our neighbors go back into their house, slamming the door behind them. The curtains remained drawn, the house as closed off as ever. But now, instead of worry, I felt a new emotion creeping in. Fear. Not for them, but of them. What had I gotten myself into? What would happen now that I'd angered these strange, reclusive people who lived right next door? As I stood there trying to process everything that had just happened, I heard a thump from the backyard. My son's ball had gone over the fence again, but this time I knew I wouldn't be going to get it back. The ball, like so much else, was lost to that mysterious, unsettling house next door. The moving truck pulled up next door on a sunny Saturday morning. I was in my front yard pulling weeds when I first saw them, a man and a young boy, probably around 10 years old. They looked tired but excited, the way people often do when they're starting a new chapter in their lives. Over the next few days, I'd see them coming and going. The man always seemed to be in a rush, juggling grocery bags or work briefcases. The boy would trail behind him, quiet and watchful. I'd wave when I saw them, and they'd wave back, but we hadn't really spoken beyond a quick hello here and there. About a week after they moved in, I was taking out the trash when I ran into the man. He introduced himself as my new neighbor, and we chatted for a bit. He mentioned he was a single dad, recently divorced, and had moved here for a fresh start. As we talked, his son came out to join us. The boy was shy, barely making eye contact, but his father encouraged him to say hello. As our conversation was winding down, the man hesitated for a moment, then asked if I'd be willing to watch his son occasionally. He explained that his new job sometimes required odd hours, and he was still trying to find reliable childcare. I agreed without much thought. I work from home most days, and I figured it wouldn't be too much trouble to keep an eye on a quiet 10-year-old now and then. The first few times I watched the boy were pretty uneventful. He'd bring a book or his handheld game console and would sit quietly in my living room while I worked. Sometimes I'd make him a snack or we'd watch a bit of TV together. His father would usually pick him up after a few hours, always profusely thanking me for my help. But as the weeks went by, I started to notice a pattern. The requests to watch the boy were becoming more frequent, and the timing was getting stranger. It started with early mornings. The father would knock on my door at 6 a.m. apologizing for the early hour, but saying he had an emergency at work. Then it was late nights, 10 p.m., 11 p.m., sometimes even later. I tried to be understanding. Being a single parent isn't easy, and I knew the father was still settling into his new job. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The boy never complained, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. He seemed more withdrawn each time he came over, his eyes often red and puffy from lack of sleep. One night, things took a turn that I wasn't prepared for. It was close to midnight when I heard a frantic knocking at my door. I opened it to find the father, looking disheveled and agitated. The boy was standing next to him, clutching a backpack and looking scared. The father spoke quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. He said there was an emergency, a family crisis, and he needed to leave town immediately. He asked if I could watch his son for the night. Before I could even fully process what was happening, he was pushing the boy towards me, thanking me profusely, and then he was gone, practically running to his car and speeding off into the night. I stood there in my doorway, stunned, with a frightened 10-year-old boy looking up at me. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't just leave him standing there. I invited him in and tried to make him comfortable, setting him up in my spare room and assuring him everything would be okay. But everything wasn't okay. One night turned into 2, then 3, then a full week. I couldn't reach the father. His phone went straight to voicemail every time I called. The boy was becoming increasingly anxious, asking when his dad would be back, and I had no answers for him. I was way out of my depth. I had no legal authority over this child, no idea where his father was or when he'd be back. I debated calling the police or child services, but I was afraid of making the situation worse. What if there really was a family emergency? What if reporting this got the boy taken away from his father? Finally, after 8 days, the father returned. It was the middle of the afternoon when I heard a car pull up. I looked out the window and saw him stumbling out of a taxi, looking nothing like the put-together man I'd met a few months ago. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty, like he'd been wearing them for days. His hair was a mess, and he had a scruffy beard that aged him by years. But it was his eyes that really caught my attention. They were bloodshot and wild, darting around nervously. I went outside to confront him, my emotions a mix of relief, anger, and concern. As he approached, I could see he was jittery, his hands shaking slightly. He thanked me for watching his son, his words slurring together slightly. He tried to brush past me to get his son, but I stood my ground, demanding an explanation. That's when I saw them, the marks on his arms. They were partially hidden by his long sleeves, but as he gesticulated wildly, trying to explain his absence. I caught glimpses of fresh track marks. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. All those odd hours, the increasingly erratic behavior, the unexplained absence, it all suddenly made horrible sense. I had been unknowingly facilitating his drug use. Every time I agreed to watch his son, I was giving him the freedom to feed his addiction. The weight of this realization was overwhelming. I felt sick to my stomach, thinking about all the times I'd sensed something was off, but had pushed my concerns aside. The father must have seen the change in my expression because he suddenly became defensive. He started making excuses, his voice rising in pitch and volume. He denied any wrongdoing, accused me of jumping to conclusions. But his eyes told a different story. There was fear there and shame. I didn't know what to do. I was angry at him for putting his son in this situation, for taking advantage of my kindness. But I was also terrified for the boy. What kind of life was he living with a father in the throes of addiction? How long had this been going on? As the father continued to rant, becoming more agitated by the moment, I made a split-second decision. I told him I was going to call child services. It wasn't an easy choice, but seeing him in this state, knowing what I now knew, I couldn't in good conscience let the boy go back with him. The moment the words left my mouth, the father's demeanor changed completely. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a look of pure panic. He begged me not to make the call, promising he would get help, swearing it would never happen again. But I could see the desperation in his eyes, the need for another fix already setting in. I stood my ground, my hand shaking as I reached for my phone. The father made a move as if to stop me, but then seemed to think better of it. He took a step back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. In that moment, he looked so broken, so far from the confident, put-together man who had first moved in next door. As I dialed the number, my mind was racing. I thought about the quiet, shy boy I'd been watching for the past week. I thought about all the signs I'd missed or ignored. I thought about how quickly an ordinary neighborly gesture had turned into this nightmare scenario. The father sat down heavily on my front steps, his head in his hands. I could hear him muttering to himself, but I couldn't make out the words. As the phone rang in my ear, I watched him, this man I thought I knew, this neighbor I thought I was helping, and I realized how little we sometimes know about the people around us, how easily we can become entangled in situations we never imagined. I was in my garden, tending to my tomatoes when I first saw them. A couple probably in their early 30s. They seemed nice enough, smiling and waving as they carried boxes into their new home. I waved back, thinking it would be good to have new neighbors after the previous house had been empty for so long. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. I'd see them coming and going, sometimes together, sometimes separately. They'd wave if they saw me outside, and I'd wave back. It was all very cordial, very suburban. But then, about a week after they moved in, I heard it for the first time. It was late in the evening, and I was sitting in my living room watching TV. At first, I thought it was coming from the show I was watching, raised voices, angry tones. But when I muted the TV, I realized it was coming from next door. I couldn't make out the words, but the emotion was clear. They were arguing, and it wasn't a minor disagreement. The man's voice was loud, aggressive. The woman's was higher-pitched, defensive. It went on for about an hour before suddenly stopping. I tried to brush it off. Couples argue sometimes, right? It's normal. But over the next few weeks, it became a pattern. Every few nights, sometimes more often, I'd hear them. The arguments always seemed to start after dark, when the neighborhood was quiet. The man's voice would rise first, then the woman's, back and forth until one of them seemed to give up. As time went on, the arguments got louder, more frequent. I started to dread the evenings, knowing that at some point, the shouting would start. I found myself listening, straining to hear if things were escalating beyond just voices. The walls of these houses are thin, and sound carries easily in the quiet of the night. One night, about a month after they moved in, things seemed different. The argument started earlier than usual, right after I heard their car pull into the driveway. The man's voice was louder than I'd ever heard it, slurring slightly. Had he been drinking? The woman's voice was quieter, but I could hear the fear in it. I sat in my living room, lights off, listening. I felt like a voyeur, but I was worried. This didn't sound like their usual arguments. I heard a crash like something being thrown or knocked over. The woman cried out, and then there was silence. My hands were shaking as I debated what to do. Should I go over there? Should I call someone? I didn't want to overreact, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Then I heard another crash, louder this time, followed by a scream that made my blood run cold. It was a sound of pure terror, cut off abruptly. Before I even realized what I was doing, I had my phone in my hand, dialing 911. The operator answered, and I tried to explain the situation as calmly as I could. I told her about the arguing, about the crashes and the scream. She assured me they would send someone right away. The wait for the police felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. I stood by my front window, peering out at the house next door. The lights were on, but I couldn't see any movement. The neighborhood was eerily quiet now, as if holding its breath. Finally, I saw the police car pull up, lights flashing but siren off. 2 officers got out and approached the house. I watched as they knocked on the door, hands near their holsters. To my surprise, both the man and woman answered the door. From where I was, I couldn't hear what was being said, but their body language told a story. The couple stood close together, the man slightly in front of the woman. They were both smiling, gesturing casually as they spoke to the officers. After a few minutes, the officers left. They didn't even enter the house. As they got back in their car, I felt a mix of relief and confusion. Had I overreacted? Had I misunderstood what I heard? I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound made me jump, wondering if the arguing would start again. But the house next door remained quiet. The next morning, I was out early, watering my front lawn. I was still mulling over the events of the previous night when I saw the woman come out of the house. She was wearing sunglasses and a long-sleeved shirt, despite the warm weather. As she walked to her car, I noticed she was moving stiffly, as if in pain. I raised my hand to wave, more out of habit than anything else. She turned towards me, and for a moment she just stood there. Then slowly, she raised her hand to wave back. As she did, her sleeve slid down slightly, revealing dark bruises on her wrist. My stomach churned at the sight. I wanted to say something, to ask if she was okay, but the words stuck in my throat. Before I could figure out what to do, the front door opened again and her husband stepped out. He called out to her cheerfully as if nothing was wrong, but there was an edge to his voice that made me uneasy. He walked up to her, putting his arm around her shoulders in what looked like an affectionate gesture, but I saw her flinch slightly at his touch. As they stood there, the woman turned her head slightly towards me. She pushed her sunglasses up, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. In that instant, I saw fear, desperation, and a silent plea for help. Her lips moved, forming words without sound. "Help me." The moment passed quickly. The husband was looking at me now, smiling and waving. His grip on his wife's shoulder seemed to tighten. I waved back automatically, feeling numb. They got into their car and drove away, leaving me standing there with the hose running, water pooling at my feet. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, replaying that moment over and over in my mind. The bruises, the fear in her eyes, those silent words. I felt sick with the realization of what was happening right next door, and with my own helplessness. I tried to go about my day normally, but I couldn't focus on anything. I kept looking out my windows, waiting for their car to return. When it did, late in the afternoon, I watched as they walked into the house. The woman was carrying grocery bags, her movements still stiff. The man followed close behind her, his hand on her back, guiding her inside. As evening approached, I found myself dreading the coming night. Would there be another argument? Would it escalate again? Should I call the police if I heard anything, even though they had dismissed it last night? I didn't know what to do. I thought about going over there, making up some excuse to check on them. But what if that made things worse? What if the husband took out his anger on his wife after I left? I considered calling a domestic violence hotline, but what could I tell them? I had no proof, just suspicions and one silent plea for help. Would that be enough? As the sun set, I sat in my darkened living room listening. The house next door was quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It felt like the calm before a storm, tense and foreboding. I thought about the woman's eyes, the fear I saw there. I thought about the bruises on her wrist, and wondered what other injuries she might be hiding. I thought about how easily they had fooled the police, presenting a united front of normalcy. The silence stretched on, becoming almost unbearable. I found myself straining to hear something, anything. A voice, a cry, a call for help. But there was nothing. As the hours ticked by, I realized that this silence was almost worse than the arguments. At least when they were shouting, I knew what was happening. This silence left too much to the imagination. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke with a start in the early hours of the morning. For a moment, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, a muffled thud from next door, followed by what sounded like breaking glass. I was on my feet instantly, heart pounding. I pressed my ear against the wall, listening intently. I could hear movement, shuffling sounds, but no voices. What was happening over there? I reached for my phone, my finger hovering over the 9 on the keypad, but I hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if I called the police again and they came to find nothing wrong, just like last night? Would that make things worse for the woman next door? But what if it wasn't nothing? What if she was in real danger right now, while I stood here debating with myself? The sound of a car engine starting made the decision for me. I rushed to my window just in time to see their car pulling out of the driveway, tires squealing as it sped down the street. In the brief moment it passed under a streetlight, I caught a glimpse of the driver. It was the woman alone, her face a mask of determination and fear. I stood there frozen as the sound of the car faded into the distance. The house next door was dark and silent once again. But now it was a different kind of silence. The silence of an empty house, of an escape made in the dead of night. I didn't know where she was going, or what had finally pushed her to flee. I didn't know if she was truly safe or if her husband would follow her. All I knew was that something had happened tonight, something that had finally broken the cycle of violence and silence. As I stood there in the dark, listening to the echoing silence, I was hit by the weight of everything that had happened, and everything I had failed to do. The signs had been there, right in front of me, and I had hesitated, unsure and afraid. I thought about all the nights I had listened to their arguments, all the times I had seen them and said nothing. The night stretched on, and I remained by the window, watching and waiting. For what? I wasn't sure. Maybe for the husband to return home and discover his wife gone. Maybe for the police to show up, alerted by someone else who had heard or seen something. Or maybe I was just waiting for the morning to come, to shed light on the dark events of the night. The first time I heard it, I was up late working on a project for my job. It was one of those quiet nights where every little sound seems amplified. At first I thought it was coming from my TV, which I had on for background noise, but when I muted it, I realized the sounds were coming from next door. It started as muffled voices rising and falling in what seemed like an argument. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Anger, frustration, maybe even fear. Then came a sound that made me sit up straight. A loud thud followed by what sounded like someone crying. I sat there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I go over there? Should I call someone? But then the sound stopped, and everything went quiet again. I told myself it was probably nothing, just a couple having a disagreement. These things happen, right? But it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I kept hearing similar noises, always at night, always when the neighborhood was quiet. Sometimes it was just raised voices. Other times I'd hear that thud again, or the sound of something breaking. And always, there was crying afterwards. I started dreading the nights. I'd lie in bed, tense, waiting for the sounds to start. Sometimes I'd put on headphones, trying to drown it out. But even when I couldn't hear it, I knew it was happening. I'd see my neighbors during the day, a couple probably in their early 30s. They seemed normal enough, always smiling and waving when they saw me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong behind closed doors. I started paying more attention to them when I saw them outside. The woman often wore long sleeves even on warm days. Once, when she was getting the mail, I saw what looked like a bruise on her wrist. She quickly pulled her sleeve down when she noticed me looking. The man was always close by, his hand on her back or arm in what looked like an affectionate gesture, but sometimes I thought I saw her flinch at his touch. One night, the sounds were worse than ever. I could hear furniture being moved, glass breaking, and a scream that made my blood run cold. I paced my living room, my phone in my hand, debating whether to call the police. What if I was wrong? What if it was nothing and I ended up embarrassing myself and angering my neighbors? But what if it was something serious and I did nothing? The decision was made for me when I heard another scream, this one abruptly cut off. My hands shaking, I dialed 911. I tried to explain the situation to the operator as calmly as I could, telling her about the ongoing disturbances and what I'd just heard. She assured me they would send someone right away. The wait for the police felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. I stood by my window, watching the street, straining to hear any sounds from next door. It was eerily quiet now. When the police car finally pulled up, I felt a mix of relief and dread. What would they find? What would happen next? I watched as two officers approached the house and knocked on the door. There was a long pause before the door opened. From where I was, I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see the body language. My neighbors were standing close together, the man's arm around the woman's shoulders. They were both smiling, gesturing as they talked to the officers. After a few minutes, to my surprise, the officers left without even entering the house. As they got back in their car, I felt a surge of frustration. Didn't they hear what I'd heard? Didn't they see what I'd seen? Just as I was about to turn away from the window, I saw my neighbors step outside. They were looking in my direction. The man raised his hand and waved, but it wasn't a friendly gesture. There was something cold in his eyes, something that made me step back from the window. The next day, I was in my front yard trying to act normal as I watered my plants. I saw the woman come out to get the mail. When she saw me, she hesitated for a moment before walking over. My stomach churned as she approached, her face unreadable behind large sunglasses. She asked me, in a voice that was almost a whisper, if I was the one who had called the police last night. I didn't know what to say. Should I deny it? Apologize? Before I could decide, she continued talking. She told me that she and her husband had been rehearsing for a play, a community theater production. They had led roles in a drama about domestic violence, and they had been practicing their scenes. I stood there, the hose running forgotten in my hand as the reality of the situation sank in. All those nights of worry, all those fears, all for nothing. I had misunderstood everything. I tried to apologize, to explain, but the words seemed inadequate. The woman just nodded, her expression still hidden behind those sunglasses, and walked back to her house. The days that followed were uncomfortable, to say the least. I'd see my neighbors coming and going, but now they no longer waved or smiled. If we happened to be outside at the same time, they'd quickly go back inside or drive away. I tried to approach them once to apologize again, but they brushed me off with cold politeness. The nights were quiet now. No more arguments, no more crying. But somehow this silence was worse. It was heavy with unspoken words and broken trust. I found myself lying awake, replaying everything in my mind, wondering how I could have gotten it so wrong. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.